We are going to dive into a new sermon series that I expect is going to take us quite some time to get through, probably through one of the most controversial books in the New Testament, the book of Romans. And I say that because I learned in seminary, when they put together translation teams for the Bible, they try to get folks from all different kinds of backgrounds. So they try to get some Calvinists and some Arminians, and some of you saying, we don't know what that really means, but what it means is some people that believe in election, some people that don't, some people believe in free will, some people don't. They try to get a good collective group of people to translate all these books into an interpretation for us, except for the book of Romans. Usually the book of Romans, it's whatever the religious views of the publishing company are, those are the people they pick to translate Romans because they hope that they can get it to say stuff that really closely aligns with their views on how we attain salvation. So you have a whole bunch of discussions in seminary about, what are we really reading? What does it really mean? And I want you to know that despite the controversies, despite the tensions between denominations because of the book of Romans, despite what people think about Paul and how he writes this letter because it's so highly theological, I think there are a lot of truths that we can glean from the book of Romans to apply to our world today. So last weekend I got a chance to get away for a little bit, and the reality of it is, as much as we try to get away, the problems that pervade our culture today are almost impossible to escape. It doesn't matter where you go, you hear about everything that happens. We live in a time that is really unprecedented in terms of our political tensions, our ethnic tensions, our economic tensions, and then you throw the pandemic on top of that, and we live in some just amazing times that I think present us an excellent opportunity as people that follow Jesus Christ. So today, I want you to do something with me. I want you to turn to the book of Romans and just go to chapter 1. And today, I have the task of setting the stage for the rest of what we're going to talk about. So I have a lot of background information that I want to get to you to set up why Paul's writing this letter to the church at Rome. So as you're turning there, if you don't have your Bible, that's okay. I've got the slides on the screen, and I'm going to try to utilize the whiteboard as well because I've worked diligently to try to make this palatable, but it's kind of difficult. So I'm trying to use a variety of ways to help you get this. So here's where we're at in this context of Romans. Here's the Roman cultural background, the characteristics that these people would have had. Rome was a polytheistic empire, which simply means they worshiped many gods. The pantheon is kind of the symbol of that polytheism. It was a Roman temple that was built to serve and be the place that many gods inhabited. Pan means many. Theon is God, many gods. So you can think about Paul in the book of Acts when he goes to Athens. Now, Athens is in Greece, but really what Rome did is they adopted the religious tendencies of the Greeks. So they just changed the names. Zeus became Jupiter, Poseidon became Neptune, Aphrodite became Venus. It's the same gods, just different names, the same religious tendencies. So think of Paul when he goes to Athens and he walks into the Areopagus and he tells the people, I see that you have statues to all kinds of gods, and you have the one statue to the unknown God, and their reasoning was, just in case we've forgotten one, we'll make a statue for that one. This is the climate that Paul is writing this letter into. They were an imperialistic society. Their government officials, we call them emperors, came to have a really high view of themselves. Now, in the Roman mindset, when an emperor would die, that emperor would become a god themselves. They would become deified. But what happened as time passed, these emperors became even more egocentric, and they decided, hey, if we're going to be a god after we die, we might as well be a god while we're alive. So they claimed to be gods on earth, and the people actually called them the saviors of the world. It was a culture of overindulgence in just about everything. Here's one example that gives you a really clear picture of how they just overindulged. There was a room in houses and other areas, other places that people gathered, called the vomitorium. What does that sound like? The vomitorium. This is the place where they would go because they would eat so much. They would basically gorge themselves. They would go to the vomitorium to relieve themselves so they could go back and eat more food. This is real history, folks. It's the truth. But food wasn't the only thing they indulged in. Sex was another area of indulgence. It was not uncommon for people to be involved in lots of sexual relationships outside of the marriage. And it was acceptable. It was the cultural norm. So that's what you have going on in Rome when Paul's writing this letter to the church. Now you also have the context of the church that you have to keep in mind. And the church was really a mixed bag because you had Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians, what Paul references in his writing sometimes as Gentiles and sometimes as Greeks. They're all the people that aren't Jewish that have come to follow Christ. Now, you have on one hand the Greeks and the Romans who have a high view of themselves, and they think that their way is the best way. And then on the other side of the spectrum with the Jews in the church, they had the same characteristics in terms of how they related to God. They had a high view of themselves because, after all, they were the chosen ones. They had the best seat in the house because they had the Scriptures. Right? Now, this is before the Bible, but they had the Old Testament, the Torah. The Jews possessed that. But what was going on in the church in Rome is that they were experiencing a lot of tensions because there was kind of an uproar about a man named Christos. You can read this outside of a biblical perspective from a Roman historian named Tacitus. So if you're one of those people that says, I just got to have proof that Jesus was a real person, write that name down, Tacitus. He was not a Christian. He was a Roman historian, and he writes the account of the Jews being kicked out of Rome because of all the problems they were raising over a man named Christus, Kristas, which would be the Greek one way of writing Christ, Christos. So because of the Jews are creating this problem, the emperor says, you got to leave Rome. So all the Jews have to disperse Rome. And at that point in history, most of the leadership roles in the church were occupied by the Jewish Christians. So when the Jewish Christians are kicked out, because they're Jewish too, it leaves some vacancies within the church. Naturally, the Greek Christians fill those vacancies. And you have two different viewpoints going on. Now, as time goes on, there's another emperor that comes to power that allows the Jews to come back to Rome. And when these Jewish Christians come back to Rome, they come back to their home churches to find that their churches are now mostly Greek Christians, Gentile Christians, and the churches are led by Greek Christians. So this creates some tension. Now, I'm not going to say division, but it creates some tension. So Romans was written at this point in time when those Jewish Christians would have been matriculating back into Rome, back into those churches. So Paul's writing into this situation. So we have the Roman cultural background, we have the church at Rome's background, and I think we have to talk also a little bit to really get a good understanding of where Paul goes with this. We have to understand Paul's background. It's important to know Paul to understand why he writes what he writes. And we can learn a lot about Paul from Luke's writing in the book of Acts. So if you don't know the story of Paul is this man's second name. He was known as Saul. And Saul was a Pharisee. which means he was Jewish. But he was a unique Jewish person because he also held Roman citizenship. Paul was instrumental in persecuting the very first people that claimed allegiance to Jesus Christ. But not as a Roman citizen. Paul was persecuting these Christians as a Jewish Pharisee because these followers of Christ posed a problem to the Institute of Judaism. The Jews don't acknowledge Christ as the Messiah. And Paul didn't acknowledge Christ as the Messiah. And Paul, as Saul, fully thought that he was carrying out the will of God by persecuting Christians. He thought he was acting on behalf of God in ridding the world of this pollution. Now, Paul, this is where it gets deep, folks, and I'm sorry, but I think it's important. Paul talks about himself as a Pharisee of Pharisees. Now, this is deeper than your average Sunday morning sermon, I'm sorry, but in the world that we live in, we got to be people that are willing to go deep. The Jewish people can be broken up into two specific sects. Maybe I should write it down. There are two sects of Judaism. There's the Hillel sect and the Shammai. They're both Jewish, but they've got some differences. Here's the differences, and here's how they originated. You can read in the Old Testament about the captivity, the Assyrian captivity and the Babylonian captivity of the Jewish people. They came into the Promised Land, these empires, and they ransacked Jerusalem, and they rounded up people, and they exported them to their own country. Now, here's what they did. They didn't take everybody. They didn't take all the Jewish people. They only took the Jewish people that were of value to them. So they took, and I'm not trying to knock or be harsh, but this is the reality. They took the intelligent ones. They took the artisans, the people that could add value to their system, their economy. So you have a group of Jewish people that stay back in the Promised Land, and they have access to the temple. And then you have a group of Jewish people that are taken away from everything that was important to their system. They're taken away from the land. They're taken away from the temple and from the people, and they're in a separate geographic location. And because they're in a different geographic location and they don't have access to the temple, which is important to their worship, and they don't have access to the Promised Land, which was their inheritance, they have to figure out a whole new way of living out their faith. All right? So Hillel was one of the Pharisees that was really big in propagating how do we live out our faith away from everything that's important or that we think is important. Just hang on with me. I'm going somewhere with this, I promise. Hillel, he boils, in one statement, he boils his philosophy down to this. All 613 laws can be boiled down to love God, don't do to others that which is hateful to you. All the rest is commentary. That's what Hillel said. So catch that. The law is important to Jewish people. 613 of them. You got to do them or don't do these things. Do this, don't do this. That's the basis, right? But he says now that we're in a different environment, here's what it seems like. All 613 laws can be boiled down to these two things: love God and don't do to others that which is hateful to you. All the rest is commentary. Now that should sound familiar to you because Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, your mind, your strength. That's the first commandment. The second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. All right. Now here's why I'm saying this. Because we know from the book of Acts chapter 22 verse 3 that Paul studied under a Pharisee named Gamaliel, who is the grandson of this guy. He's a Hillel Jew. Okay? But here's where it gets even more interesting. Paul is actually a Shemay Jew. Now, the difference between the two is that these people, you better keep all 613 laws and not boil them down to 2. It's not just commentary, they're important. Now, why am I telling you all this? Because I want you to see that Paul is the perfect candidate to speak to a church that is feeling that exact same tension. It's just cloaked in different terms. It's Roman, it's Greek, and Jew. He's the perfect candidate to come into this situation having experienced the teaching of something completely different than his thought process. But not only having been taught those things and he experiences those things on the road to Damascus when he encounters the living Jesus Christ. Because Paul, who lives in this mindset of 613, he experiences the grace of God in a very real way when he encounters Jesus Christ. And interestingly enough, Paul then starts to lean more toward this school of thought just in the church. Not in the Jewish context, but in the context of the church. So that's a lot of background. So here's what Paul does. He addresses the Roman culture in this letter, and he addresses the 2 perspectives of the church in this letter. He addresses the Greek Christians, he addresses the Jewish Christians, and Paul holds nothing back. This is why I like Paul so much. I can identify with Paul on a number of levels. I can identify with Paul because Paul recognizes he's the chief sinner, he's been saved by God's grace, and when I think about myself, there are certainly days in my life when I think I'm the chief sinner and I can only be saved by God's grace. And then there are also times when Paul he just speaks, he just tells it like it is. And if you've known me for a long time, you know that that's one of the areas of life that I really struggle with, is sometimes I just tell it like it is, and that's not always the best way to be. But Paul gets away with it, I don't. So are you lost yet? We're going to skip the first 15 or 16 verses, but I want to tell you what it is. It's just an introduction, and it says, this is what's important to me. I'm Paul. I'm writing this letter, and I'm writing it to you. I care about you. I love you. And I have some intentions I want to tell you. I want to let you know what the gospel is. I want to clearly define what sin is, and I want to clearly define what God's faithfulness and righteousness is all about. So this book that's been difficult to navigate, hard to digest, I think it's those things. I think it's hard because what it does is it challenges the status quo. And when we read Romans in our context, it's going to challenge the status quo. It should challenge the way that we live life. It should challenge the way that we behave as a church. So the latter part of chapter 1 really outlines sin. And this is where we're going to spend the most of our time this morning. I know you're saying, wow, you're already about halfway through where you usually are. Hold on tight. Here's a pattern I want you to listen for as we read this. Paul begins to repeat this pattern in chapter 1, and he does so throughout the entirety of the book. He says, people know God, people reject God, what they know about God, and God hands them over to their desires. That's the pattern. People know God, people reject God or what they know about God, and God hands them over to their desires. Okay? So one of the questions that a lot of scholars ask when they're trying to, give their perspective on Romans is, who is Paul writing this book to? Is it really to the Greeks? Is it to the Jews? And you can read different commentators will tell you, well, this book is written right straight to the Gentiles. And other commentators will say, well, it's written to the Jewish people with little regard to the Gentiles. And I want you to know that I fall right in the middle. I say it's written to both. When you carefully read the text, you can see that there are certain times when Paul is addressing Gentile readers and certain times when he's addressing Jewish readers. He starts off, I believe, by addressing the Greek Christians, the Gentile Christians. And here's where I want to start reading. In verse number 18. I have it on the screen. I'm going to do something very strange. I want to read verses 18 through the rest of the chapter. I know it's a big chunk. And then I want to address it in reverse order. So I want to read it like it's written, and then I want to talk about it backwards. Okay? The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people. And in different translations, this word wickedness will say unrighteousness. So what Paul is doing is he's contrasting the desires of people against God. Because in the verses previous to this, 16 and 17, Paul said, "For I'm not ashamed of the gospel because it's the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile." And then he says this, "For in the gospel the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, or faith to faith. Just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith." So when he starts off, he is contrasting the righteousness of God to the unrighteousness of people. He says, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness or unrighteousness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them because God has made it plain to them. And when we get through this, you're going to say, man, this is a lot. Trust me. I know it's a lot. I'm going to break it down. "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore," notice this is the last part of the pattern. "Therefore God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts." Hang on to that phrase, sinful desires of their hearts. "To sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. Because of this, God gave them over," there it is again, "to shameful lust. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind, so that they do what ought not to be done. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them." I have one question. What is the problem? This is what Paul's answering. What is the problem? What really is going on? We can ask the same question about our world today. What is the problem? Why is it every time we turn on the news, we open up our news feeds on social media, why is it filled with just evil? You can follow the stories. Pedophilia running rampant. Corruption in politics. And I'll even go so far as to say that organizations padding numbers to make a pandemic seem worse than it is. Evil, pervasive evil. Now, I told you I was going to make this digestible, and here it goes. We're going to start at the end and go back to the beginning. And what I want you to see is what we think is sin is really not sin. Just hold on. Here's what Paul says first. In that last verse, people approve evil. Now, I really in my notes have unrighteousness, but there's not enough space to write that. And I'm afraid I'll spell it wrong, and Shannon will give me a bad grade. This is what Paul says in verse 32. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, look, he says they not only continue to do these very things, but they approve of those who practice them. What is the problem? Well, this is not the problem. This is the symptom. People approve evil. This was happening in Rome, and it certainly happens today. We live in a culture that approves evil. If you don't believe me, just Google pure evil and see what pops up, and you'll see a culture that celebrates this. We had, a discussion about this last weekend on our trip, and some people were scared because we talked about evil being very real. But the reality is that there's a lot of people that like that kind of thing. Now, I don't watch horror movies. I'm not a fan of them. But I want you to know that that's one way our culture celebrates evil is by producing horror movies. It's normalizing it. All right, don't get mad at me yet. There's a lot more to go. All right, so people approve evil. Here's what Paul says next. So we're going the progression in reverse order. People practice evil. People do bad things. And some of you say, man, I'm sure glad I'm not on that list. Well, I said the same thing until I read on the list. Let's see. He says they're filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. That's evil. And then this is the practice of that. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips. Okay, I'm good so far. Slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant. I've been guilty of that. Boastful. Been guilty of that. They invent ways of doing evil. And now here's the one that catches us all. So I got news for you, you bunch of evil people. Disobeying their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Now I want you to know what is going on here is Paul is putting the hammer down. All right? This is what Paul does. Paul tears these people down. But he also builds them back up. All right, so I want you to know that every single one of you sitting in here this morning, we should see this list and we should say, my God, we're evil people. All right, now what Paul has done is he's saying, these people practice evil, but this isn't the problem. This is the symptom. Now see, this is where we would say, oh, look at them, bunch of sinners. Slandering, sin. God-haters, sin. Boastful, sin. And we have a tendency to do that in the church. We think the things that we do or don't do are sin. But Paul says, no, that's not the sin. That is the outcome of the sin. So what we call sin in the church most often is just trespasses. The problem is much deeper than the trespass. The trespass is a result of something worse. All right. Now, how did these people get to this point? This is what he says in this verse. Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind, so that they do what ought not to be done. Now, listen, God didn't make these people have a depraved mind. He said he gave them over to a depraved mind. The Bible clearly tells us that God's going to give us the desires of our hearts. And if the desires of our hearts are evil, he's going to give us over to that. So these people thought evil things. So people think evil thoughts. Now, hopefully you're starting to say, oh, I can see how one thing leads to another. First, it starts with the thought, then it leads to the action. Then, after the action takes place, then we start to approve other people of doing the same thing. This is what Paul, sin is a slippery slope. Say that 10 times fast. Sin is a slippery slope, and it starts to happen, first off, when we think about evil things. Think unrighteous thoughts. Now, why are people thinking unrighteous thoughts? Well, God handed them over to their own desires, right? But it doesn't just say that here. It says it in verses 24 through 27 as well. Therefore, God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts. Right? God gave them what they wanted, what they desired. That's the beautiful thing about God. God is willing to even let us delve into evil things if that's what we really want. And then he lists to sexual impurity, and we won't read all of those, but you can see verses 25 through 7. They make an exchange. They exchange the truth about God for a lie, and that's important. We'll talk about that in a minute. They worship created things rather than the Creator. So what happens is, here's where the God part comes in. Notice people, and then God. I'm just going to say, gives us what we want. So God gives us what we want. That's how good he is. Even when we want what he knows isn't best for us, he'll let us have it. Now we get to the pinnacle. So this is a symptom. This is a symptom. This is a symptom. This is an effect of what happens next. And this is where Paul goes with this. Now, this is the problem. We ask the question, what is the problem and why do we experience some of the things that we still experience today? The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. For although they knew God, this is the key. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave him thanks, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal human beings and birds and animals and reptiles. So in layman's terms, people replace God. That's the problem. People replace God. That's the story that we're told in Genesis. Adam and Eve replace God. They don't listen to what God determines is best. They become gods themselves and say, well, we think this is okay. What's the problem with the world that we live in? People replace God. Now, what does that mean? How did they do that? People replace God, Paul says, by suppressing the truth. He says that a couple different times, a couple different ways. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth. by their unrighteousness. I'm going to try to wrap this up quickly, but I got a few more things I need to get in here. Here's what's important to understand, and this is important for our context. Paul was writing into this culture that even though it was polytheistic and they worshiped many gods, he was writing into this culture where everyone acknowledged the reality of creation. There wasn't a question about that in their minds. Paul's using their own philosophy and logic against them, so to speak. He's saying you all acknowledge the fact of creation, but you're denying the Creator. So what they did was they had this knowledge. He says it's called natural revelation. You can look at creation and come to the conclusion that there is a Creator. And what you know and how you live don't align, is what Paul's saying. You're suppressing the truth by the things that you're doing. And we know that we've already talked about this. Rome was a place of unrestraint, lavish livings, a culture of power and control. And it was a culture that replaced God with many gods. And in many ways, that culture, the Roman culture, looks eerily similar to the culture that we live in. Our culture is one of extravagance. It's one of power and control. And if you don't believe me that this is a country that is just absolutely in love with power and control, just watch our politics. I don't care what party you align with, Democrat or Republican, they both just want power. They want to control people. And our culture says if you want it, you have the right to it. Our government operates under the name of democracy, but the reality is, the place that we've come to in our country today is that people look to our leaders as some form of salvation. There are people that really think in November, whether it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden, that man is going to save us from the depravity that we live in. So we're the same, and that's concerning. But I want to tell you that the most concerning part is not how we're similar, it's how we're different than the Roman people. I told you this was going to be hard. So this is how we're different, and this is more alarming. Paul could speak of creation and people witnessing to the fact of one true Creator God because of their belief in creation. We live in a culture, folks, that we now have a narrative that competes with creation. We have a generation of children that are growing up with a narrative that would say there is something other than creation out there. So the problem in our world thickens. Paul says these people are unrighteous because they suppress the truth. They suppress what they know about God. We live in a culture that we can really say for the first time in a long time, we have people that absolutely have no idea of the existence of a Creator God because we've created a competing narrative. That's how evil we have gotten. It gets worse. In Paul's time, people to some degree still believed in absolute truth. Our culture, we've gone so far as to attack the validity of absolute truth, and now we talk about relative truth. We live in a society that would say there's no such thing as absolute truth. And how can you suppress the truth if there's no absolute truth? You see how evil we've become? And the sad thing is, we approve of it. We say it's okay. It's all right. It's okay to have a different story. And what does Paul say about this? And why are we experiencing the things that we're experiencing? You know, there's a whole lot of talk now more than ever about Revelation and the end times. And I see some of you sharing stuff on Facebook and asking me all kinds of different questions. And I've never been the type of person or preacher to try to scare people to death and say these are the last days. But my God, what is happening to our world? The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. We live in a world that is suppressing truth now more than ever, and the wrath of God is being revealed. And now if that scares you, I'm sorry. So what's the problem with the world today? Well, it's the exact same thing that was wrong with the world when Paul wrote this letter. And it's not what people do. It is not what people do. The problem is that people have a disposition that is set against God. And that is how Paul identifies sin. The things that we think are sin are just the outcomes of sin. Paul says that sin is having a disposition that is set against God. Just like Jesus tells us that righteousness is a position, a disposition of the heart, sin is a disposition of the heart. That's why I try to pray as often as I can, God, create in me a clean heart, because I know I have evil tendencies. And man, that's hard to hear. All this is like doom and gloom, but I want you to know that the reason Paul starts this off is because he has good news. That's what the gospel means. Euangelion that Paul talks about is the good news. So what's the good news? We're going to unpack that as we continue to go through this series, but I want to give you a snapshot of the good news. Because we live in a world that feels like the wheels are falling off of it, the brakes are completely gone, and we're spinning out of control. This past weekend, I wasn't here. I was in Tennessee having fun. I'm having fun now, too. And there was 6 of us on the trip. All of us were either brothers or cousins, last name Tipton. We took a whitewater rafting trip. And I have to admit, my brother Shane had been on a couple different trips, and he was all excited and ready to go. And I have to admit, there was a little hesitation. I was a little nervous about how this was going to go down. But we get into an inflatable boat onto a river that I had never been on before. Didn't know the river, didn't know the twists, the turns, where the rocks were. My brother, I think, had taken that trip before, but there was one person in that boat that knew the river better than anybody else, and his name was Wesley. He was the guide. Now, Wesley was a pretty interesting character. He was kind of a hippie type guy, long hair, not a care in the world. I think what he does, he told us what he does for a living is he teaches kids to snowboard, and he said it's not very lucrative, but it's good for the soul. That's what kind of person Wesley was. We carry the boat down the ramp, and Wesley's telling us, "Hey, is this your guys' first time?" And of course, most of us, except Shane, said, "Yeah, it's our first time." He said, "Well, don't worry, I'm going to get you down the river safely. There won't be any problems." And I said, "Okay." The reality of this story is that we didn't know Wesley from Adam. Didn't know anything about this guy. We just know that when they said, "Hey, Tipton, you guys are going to be with Wesley," we look over there with a guy with no shirt, long hair, and shorty shorts on. It's like, well, okay. But we trusted that he would do what he said he would do. We trusted that he would get us from point A to point B and do so without any harm. Wesley knew the river. Wesley knew the areas of the river that he could have a little fun. He could dump some people out and there would be no problem. Wesley knew when he had to be diligent to avoid unnecessary spots to risk injury. And Wesley did what he said he was going to do. He got us to the end and we were all safe and sound. One guy fell out, but it was intentional. Wesley dumped him out. He tried to get more of us, but we were too good. But after he dumped him out and we got him back in, we had chit-chat. He said, "Well, I knew if I dump somebody out here, I knew that there was a good stretch where there was no snags, nothing under there, and that I could let him fall out and we'd be able to get him back in, no problem." So I set out on the trip a little hesitant, a little nervous. I didn't know what to expect. But I learned that when Wesley said paddle forward, he would yell commands. It would either be forward or backward, and they'd give you a number, 1, 2, or 3. Forward 2, paddle forward 2, all in unison. Or backward 3, paddle and backward 3. You had to do what he said, right? If you wanted it to go well, you did what he said. I told Wesley at the end of that trip, I said, hey man, I'm going to use you in a sermon illustration. I'm a pastor and I'm going to use you in a sermon illustration. He said, really? I said, yeah, and you're going to be God. He said, that's a pretty big task. But as I reflected on that, I realized that's exactly what this life is like. And what we're experiencing, folks, is we're in that raft and we're floating down the river and God's in the back. He's guiding the boat. And while we may be experiencing some turbulence and we might be experiencing some rocky paths, what we're going to find Paul doing is he's going to justify how we can trust God, why we can believe what God says. And just like Wesley, God has given us his word right here. I'm going to get you to the end safely. I'm going to be there. I'm going to take you all the way through safely. And I know when I can allow you to experience a little turbulence because I know that I can keep you safe when we do it. So as we continue through this series, we're going to see Paul's thoughts on God's faithfulness. That's what this book is really about. It's about the depravity of people and the faithfulness of God in that. It's about how evil we can be and how God is still faithful to us. And my prayer is that in the midst of the evil that we experience, that all of us could come to a place where we could relinquish the desire to replace God with the desire for more of God. And that's the challenge I want to issue this morning. I want you to take some time to really evaluate. Do I really have a desire for more of God, or do I replace God with things in life? We don't acknowledge that we live in a polytheistic culture, but we really do. We serve a lot of different gods. And right now, I think my warning for the church is, because I've been so brokenhearted about the condition of the church and how we view our government. Don't get caught up in the politics of our culture, because that has become a god. And I know that I might experience some backlash for saying this, but we, the people of God, were never intended to live under a democracy. We have this idea that the democracy is the saving grace of the world. We were never intended to live under a democracy. We were intended to live under a theocracy where God is our king. And that's what Paul's doing here in this letter. He's challenging the Roman system, and he's saying you need to replace anything other than the one true creator God. You need to replace that with him. Would you do that? Would you be willing to experience life with God as your king, God as your savior? Let's pray. Father, I'm so thankful for your steadfast love, your faithfulness, your mercy, your grace. I'm so thankful that you do what you say you will do, even in our weakness and when we fall short and when we don't keep our end of the covenant. You are the one that makes this covenant work. God, I confess there are times in my life that I replace you with other things, other people. There are times in my life when my desire really isn't for more of you, it's something else. And like your servant David, my cry is that you would create in me a clean heart and renew a steadfast spirit within me, Father. As your body, we've done the very same thing. As a church, we've replaced you with other things. We've made other things our goal. And we ask your forgiveness. God, give us a desire for more of you as a group of people. Help us to see your steadfastness and faithfulness in the midst of the evil that we experience every day. Give us the courage that we need to be people of truth and not people who suppress the truth. And let us walk forward boldly, clothed in your righteousness alone. I pray these things in your Son, Jesus' name. Amen.